Greetings. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to speak with you about mortality management. My name is Dale Rozeboom. I'm on the faculty at Michigan State University in the Department of Animal Science. And I have been working with mortality management for about 20 years in my capacity as an extension specialist here at MSU, helping farmers with various livestock enterprises deal with mortality on their farm and make plans for what might happen in the future. So I'm pleased to talk with you here today. The goals of my presentation are to prepare technicians, technical service providers, water technicians, conservation technicians with the basic knowledge of handling mortality management, understanding mortality management methods that are accepted by NRCS or accepted by your state, your various volunteer environmental programs, to understand those methods better. My second goal is to be able to evaluate the suitability of that method for that production system and in that state. And then finally, to be able to assess if the mortality management method is sized appropriately for the flow of tissue from on-farm animal death, from death to final disposition of that material that remains. So throughout my talk, I will be mentioning various quantities of mortality per unit of time. And it will be mixed in throughout my talk, and I hope that you can compare those systems, compare those amounts, and what I call oftentimes flow of mortality within the farming system. So the objectives of my presentation are to understand what mortality really is, to introduce then the methods that can be used for mortality management, and then to talk a little bit about estimating those daily mortality rates, the mass and volumes that are used, maybe published someplace, but that are used generally to prepare for mortality management. Important materials that I would encourage everyone to reference or to be aware of, and those that I've referenced here, state dead animal acts and regulations. Every state has, in the past, determined what are the most appropriate ways to handle mortality. And so they have enacted an act and accompanied that act with regulations. That's true for the state of Michigan. We call it the Bodies of Dead Animal Act in Michigan. Other states have those as well. Then there are other documents that are critical. And for technical service providers that work for NRCS, there is the Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan Technical Criteria, which was written in September of 2009. And then following that, there have been two standards that have been written. One for animal mortality facilities, Standard 316, and another specifically for composting facilities, and that's called Standard 317. Those I would call required or very essential important materials. Then there are some other suggested materials, and these support some of the calculations we make, support some of the practices that we adopt in implementing these methods of mortality management. USDA APHIS periodically releases reports about livestock production on farms, and within those reports they'll talk about mortality rates. What would be common? What would be normal and natural? And that's the first time I've said that today, and I'll use that term furthermore in my talk. But normal and natural mortality rates. And then there is a document, Lesson 51, in the National Livestock and Poultry Environmental Stewardship Curriculum. And that lesson talks more about mortality management and the options we're going to go through. An excellent publication. Another excellent publication is the National Agricultural Biosecurity Center Consortium Carcass Disposal Working Group publication, published in 2004 by Kansas State University. And then lastly, a few other excellent publications were put out by the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. We call that the CAST, Bulletins on Carcass Disposal. And those have been in the last 5 to 6 years as well. And you can reference those. Excellent documents. So then let's proceed. Let's talk about what mortality is. Obviously the death of animals on the farm. And that's the context we're going to use today, on farm. And it's generally those deaths that occur before the final intended use of that animal. And in most cases, it would be the harvest of meat products or the harvest of milk and the harvest of fiber in the case of some of the wool or hair-bearing breeds and species of livestock that would be used on farms. So before its final intended use. There's also then mortality, the death of animals that occur at its predetermined conclusion. In other words, we expect death to occur. And in our production systems, there would be death that's due to old age. It may surprise us at times, but we know that the animal has reached its full duration of its productive life. And we sometimes call that natural death. Then there are the deaths of animals that come at a predetermined time. And I use the example of spent hens possibly, where their production, their productivity is diminishing quickly, and the decision is made then that those animals would be euthanized. And in the case if the animals don't have value, then it would be the farm's responsibility to deal with those carcasses if they have no food value at that point. And then on a very rare and small percentage of the time, there are some biomedical animals that are sacrificed for medical purposes. We might sacrifice animals when working with your veterinarian and determining what might be a disease organism that's prevalent on the farm, or why animals may be contracting disease, how they're dealing with that disease, typically called a necropsy. And so we might sacrifice animals for necropsy on the farm. What are other causes of death then? And I already introduced you to the term normal and natural. Normal and natural means those deaths that are caused by common disease and injury. There are diseases that are common to the farm and to production of various livestock species. And those would be more so your flus, sometimes some respiratory diseases, a few reproductive diseases. They're distinguished from what we call not common diseases, those that may be transboundary, and I refer to that at the lower portion of the slide, those that might be foreign animal diseases, catastrophic in their nature in that they cause severe problems, and they may even be zoonotic in that they may cause disease in humans. But normal and natural can be because of that common disease or injury to the animal, just going through normal routine production. Normal and natural is sometimes then described as routine. I just use the term routine. Normal and natural may be also then referred to routine. Normal and natural may be those animals that are euthanized when moribund, or when they've reached a point where they're suffering and not responding to treatment. Then a decision needs to be made that those animals be euthanized. I talked in the previous slide about some intentional conclusions where we euthanize them at a determined time. And then there is catastrophic mortality. These are the unexpected events that cause a large number of animals to either die or to have to be euthanized in response to a situation. We have physical disasters like flood, hurricanes, roof cave-ins under snow loads, and others. Electrical outages would be another example. And then we have those serious diseases we now refer to as transboundary. And historically, we've sometimes called them foreign animal diseases. But again, those are the ones that governments around the world are trying to keep out of their livestock systems because of the severity of consequences of those diseases. And so those could lead to a mass euthanization effort in order to control the disease and to eliminate it. Mortality has its cost, and this is just a short slide showing that we do recognize that routine and normal natural mortality as well as catastrophic mortality, we lose the value of those products that are produced from those animals. Plus we incur the cost of taking care of those carcasses. I call it carcass management, and prefer to do so over the word disposal, although historically for years we've termed carcass disposal as the intent of our laws and regulations, but we're looking for new opportunities in the methods we use to maybe recycle those nutrients that are present in those animals when they do die in those carcasses. And so, but that is not without cost, and that is the point I'd like to just make here. Mortality then, other than the cost, is reason for other concerns. And a carcass is the source of organic matter. It has nutrients in it. And so those nutrients may become then a water quality concern if the effluent leaves the site where those carcasses are being managed. And those same nutrients then might become an air quality concern if they are emitted during a breakdown process. And then they might, those nutrients might lead to the presence of vermin that find them a readily available food source. And they might be in the form of small critters or insects. And so mismanagement of carcasses could lead to excessive amounts of these problems. And then there is the potential for these carcasses to be the source of other hazards, in particular pathogens. If we have known pathogens in those carcasses, they could be disease-related, or they could be common pathogens or microflora that become pathogenic to other animals and humans. And then there's also the concern of toxins, whether they be chemical toxins, which historically we've had in Michigan with PBB in our carcasses, and how we deal with that, and what the potential of those toxins are in the future after we've chosen a method of management. Do those toxins persist? So we plan to manage. And for comprehensive nutrient management planning, in the case of technical service providers, we are required to plan for both normal mortality in the CNMP technical criteria, and we're required to develop a plan for catastrophic mortality management. And that would be required by the CNMP. Now, in your voluntary environmental programs that may be in the state or other states, those too require the planning of mortality management. Let's talk a little bit more about the importance of normal and natural mortality. And it is my intent that throughout the rest of my talk, the majority of it will be about normal and natural mortality. Most laws, including in a state, read that the normal and natural mortality must be intrinsic to an operation under common ownership or management. That means that farms can be a group of several sites, farm sites, but all the animals are under common management or ownership. Therefore, the mortality on these various sites can be managed in a single system. That's important to note, that all farm sites do not have to have their own mortality management system. They may if the farmer so chooses, but they do not have to by law. And then normal and natural, I make a point right here that we want to make sure that everybody understands that it's normal and natural. And if there were a rapid or great increase in mortality, that all farmers would report such to their veterinarian, and that report might be then made to the state. Why is that? On the right side of my slide here, I'm showing just an old graphic from the United Kingdom. And when they broke with foot and mouth disease several years ago, it shows the rapid spread and how many animals were involved, thousands and thousands that had to be euthanized and disposed of. And had the farmers at the very beginning, the couple of farmers that had a rapid increase in mortality or saw some symptoms of foot and mouth early on and had not sold those animals, they might have saved a lot of animals from being destroyed and saved the profitability of the livestock industries there. So if that were to happen in our own country, in our own state, we had a change in mortality on my own farm, if I'm speaking as a farmer, I would report that right away, because that is not normal and natural. And it may be the cause of something very severe to the entire state and country. Okay. Routine or total normal mortality. How do we figure that? How do we figure the total weight of those of animal carcasses coming from a farming enterprise? We need to know the capacity of production on that farm, whether it be 100 cows or whether it be 100,000 laying hens at any one time. Capacity would be how many animals would be there at any one time, and preferably the maximum number of animals. Then we need to know what is a normal mortality rate. And the farmers can tell you this. They know this by experience. We do, as I said in the beginning, have publications, surveys that have been done over many farms that give us some normal mortality rates, but we prefer to use the farm's rate when they have that. We then know that we have a capacity, we know how many, we know what the rate is, but then we need to know how much of the lifetime a flock or a group of animals spends on that farm. Sometimes we refer to that as turns or groups. And so with the number of groups, the amount of time they spend, the mortality rate within that group, and the total capacity, we combine that then with the last factor, and that is what are their average weight when they experience that death. We can take those then and we can calculate, in this case, what's shown here, yearly loss, but it could be on a shorter period of time. But for yearly loss, then we take that capacity times the turns, times the rate, times the weight. And that will give us, in this case, pounds or kilograms or a unit of mass per year. Now, at the very bottom of the slide, I show you a weight to volume conversion factor for poultry, swine, and bovines, cattle carcasses. But what this says then is that for every 45 pounds of poultry, that takes up about a cubic foot of space, whether that be in a truck, whether that be in another type of container, whether that be in a compost system. We need to have a conversion back to the amount of space it takes or volume. So we call that a weight to volume conversion factor. It's important when you're planning a system to know that you have the space to handle the mortality that will be produced in that period of time. So I'll go through a couple of slides here just showing then mortality rates and weights. And these I've taken from the Livestock Production Environmental Series as well as those USDA APHIS bulletins. We see on our left-hand column the growth stage for different poultry enterprises, broilers, layers, breeding hens, turkey females and males. The center column then gives you an average mortality rate based from surveys that have been done on farms, and then the average weight in pounds of that mortality. And generally, in planning, we err on the high side with weight. We're going to be conservative and give ourselves extra space in the system. So these weights may be a little heavier than what some farmers would say are the weights of their mortality. And so in planning a mortality system, again, use the farmers, but explain to them that being conservative is important in developing the volume and flow of that system. I then have charts here for swine, laid out the same way with a growth stage, a mortality rate, and a weight. And then I have the same then for cattle and horses, where we talk about growth stages, stages of life, and the rates and weights for those. So we can find these two important factors then from resources as shown here. So let's just talk about then how we manage mortality. I want to switch now. And all state laws, not nearly all of them, I was going to make a mistake, but all state laws require that mortality must be taken care of. I use the word disposed of here, but they must be put into the management system and within 24 to 72 hours of death. In Michigan, it's 24 hours. The farmer has 24 hours to do this. The exceptions to this rule are that the carcass could be stored refrigerated for a maximum of 7 days, or could be stored frozen for a maximum of 30 days. This is important. In some cases, the mortality management, in the case of rendering, for example, you may use refrigerated storing until the rendering truck comes and takes the carcass away, because that event may occur longer than 24 hours after the death of that animal. The other exceptions in state laws have these written in, and I just show them here. They're non-related farm mortality or animal tissue byproducts in the case of grease that would come from lard, educational institutions, and animal control agencies. But the farm mortality are talked about at the beginning of the slide. So let's talk about methods of mortality management. I've listed here the 5 most popular. States may allow for other methods, and I'll allude to that a little bit later. But these are the 5 most popular: burial, incineration, rendering, landfill, and composting. In some states, burial and landfill are addressed together. A state considering landfill a form of burial. In the state of Michigan, burial and landfill are described in the rules as separate management methods. Burial. In Michigan, all burial body parts have to be at least 2 feet beneath the natural surface at the end of burial. They can have no contact with bodies of water, and that would include surface waters as well as groundwaters. So site selection for burial has to consider the high water table in the ground. Burial also has to be 200 feet from wells. Each state has criteria similar to this and even more detailed than this, or could be less detailed. But it is set forth in the bodies of dead animal acts and regulations. The detail may go on to be something further like this. How do we figure how much mortality we can manage given a site in a field that we're going to intend to use? We need to consider if the dead animal law or regulations has a limitation on the amount of mortality that could be used per unit of area, most commonly per acre. So, individual graves are allowed for in the state of Michigan and other states. Those have to be closed within 24 hours beneath 2 feet of soil. In Michigan, we're allowed to have 100 graves per acre, or a maximum of 5 tons per acre, whichever comes first. Those individual graves have to be separated by a minimum of 2.5 feet. So if you drew a grid over an area of land, you could see that those spaces individual graves could be about 21 by 21 feet. And that 5 tons per acre would allow for 100 100-pound animals or 10 1,000-pound animals in an acre. And that would be abiding then by the dead animal regulations. Dead animals may also be buried in a common grave. A common grave is where you would dig a larger hole and you would make additions over a period of time. In the case of Michigan, we have a maximum amount of 2.5 tons per acre. And those common graves then have to be separated by 100 feet. Each addition to that common grave has to be covered by a minimum of 1 foot of soil within 24 hours. And the entire grave cannot remain open for longer than 30 days. And then the final grave has to be closed with 2 feet of soil once again. So, a common grave, we can see that we could probably have 4 grave sites per acre using calculation of 30 days maximum open. And so you're looking at then only 2.5 tons per acre. So it's more restrictive on a total mass basis. But you need to be aware of what the limitations are, and that will dictate what your flow is for burial. Where burial can occur as far as a tool to determine water table and the most appropriate soil types, Web Soil Survey from NRCS is an excellent tool. It's been developed in recent years. It actually has a function where you can determine burial sites, not just for catastrophic, The tool can be used for routine burial as well, and I just make reference of that tool here. We're not going to go further in how it is specifically used. Constructed burial pits. In some states, burial pits are still allowed, although that trend is becoming fewer and fewer states. And it is because the practice is just a structured burial pit with fabricated sidewalls and a fabricated cover. The bottom of the pit, though, is just exposed subsoil. And so you would make carcass additions through a manhole cover or some other type of lid, and those carcasses would then just decay. You could add lime or another dry substance for odor control, but the carcasses just decay. So therefore, liquids in the carcass are treated by the subsoil that's beneath. Because of the risk associated with that leaching of liquids downward, many states, like I said, are going away from allowing this method. It is not allowed for in Michigan. Burial pits, as I say, have solid walls. The problems are it's difficult to flow mortality. You don't know how fast that decay is taking place. You don't know how to close that site at the end of its useful life, and it could be a point source, again, as I said, of pollution. There are some older documents where they talk about so many birds per cubic feet of capacity, and those can be referenced if that's true in a state where you might be considering this as a method. Let's switch to incineration. Cremation is a controlled and rapid oxidation of organic matter, including that of carcasses. It is a complete reduction of volume. It destroys nearly all pathogens. It's expensive because of the initial cost and energy cost that you need, natural gas or diesel fuel. It is not used for coal or oil, old tires, and the lit cigarette methods. It's really intended to be a controlled burn. It oxidizes volatile gases. An air quality permit is required in nearly all cases, all states, including Michigan. And incineration can be done at a large capacity, shown here institutionally or commercial. This just shows a diagram, how those animals flow into the incinerator, how the ash is accumulated and dealt with according to your Dead Animal Act. And it shows in particular the secondary burner, which is critical for ensuring that the gases and any aerosol particulates are burnt completely. More commonly on farm for routine management of mortalities, if you're choosing to use incineration, you would find a piece of equipment that looks like that shown here. No product endorsement is intended, just that it shows the secondary burning system as well as the initial burning, a loading door that's counterweighted to allow for ease and use. But these types, they're very efficient and are very effective with varied amounts of mortality. So they can be sized for very large amounts of mortality, anywhere from 50 to maybe a ton and a quarter of mortality per hour, depending on the BTUs that can be produced to burn those carcasses. So they're very efficient and are very effective with varied amounts of mortality. So they can be sized for very large amounts of mortality on maybe some of your larger bovine farms. The longevity of them depends on their maintenance and typically varies from 5 to 10 years. Rendering is another common method. It has been most popular historically. The amount of rendering has diminished more recently because of concerns of prions, in particular that of BSE in cattle. But the intention and the goals of rendering still are very effective and very sound in their reason in that we can take carcasses and we can retain value-added products from those carcasses in the form of tallow, meat and bone meal, grease, and hides. And so rendering still has a place, As we learn more about managing animal pathogens and prions, the rendering industry will continue to have an important part in our mortality management. Rendering service, though, however, has to be brought to the farm, and it may not be available in all areas. So then it brings us to what are the pros and cons of rendering, and I just said this at the very bottom, and I'll work my way up. Some parts of the state are too far away from a rendering plant, and the justification for a pickup in that area is not sound, and so you don't have those services. Other parts of the state, fees are required for that pickup, and so it could be costly, $50, $100 to stop and pick up one carcass. As I alluded to when I was describing refrigeration and freezing, storage of the animal carcass may be required until that pickup occurs if it is delayed more than 24 hours after the death of that animal. Farmers need to keep that in mind and not allow those carcasses to lay around and become the nuisance that the Dead Animal Act is written to avoid. Rendering can handle flexible amounts, anywhere from single carcasses all the way up to 1,000 tons or more in a single event. They are becoming more and more prepared to be a part of a catastrophic plan, but they can handle large amounts. Low maintenance for the farmer in general if those pickups are on a consistent and constant basis. It's a very biosecure method, and it, as I said, recycles those nutrients. Landfill. In Michigan, we have landfills that will take carcasses. Availability must be determined and negotiated with that landfill. Agreements must be signed. Landfills have the flexibility to handle various flows of mortality from small to large farms. Generally, for small farms, there is no pickup by the waste management company. Therefore, the farm must deliver that mortality, must avoid those then complaints of transporting mortality, and be aware of the biosecurity risk of going into the landfill areas and then coming home to their farms. They must take time to sanitize those vehicles, make sure that they're not bringing home pathogens. A license is not required in most states for the farm to make delivery of its own mortality to a landfill, and that would be the case in Michigan. One other approach to landfill that we've seen used more commonly on farms, and that is what I call landfill after a temporary time of composting. A farm might use a sealed container dumpster from a landfill and temporarily compost the mortality for 2 to 4 days. Let's talk now about composting. In the last 2 decades, the amount of composting on farms has increased dramatically. It is the controlled biological decomposition of organic material under both aerobic and anaerobic conditions. The anaerobic conditions occur because the body of the animal is intact. Composting, contrary to some of the early publications where it mentioned that composting was above ground burial, is not just above ground burial. It is the management of carcasses and material through a process. We don't just leave them lay buried above the ground. Our goal of composting is that the storage, handling, and land application of the compost material can be done without adversely affecting the environment or the people. Therefore, the carcasses are not recognizable. The material is aesthetically acceptable. It's not a nuisance, both odor, flies, and all of those other ways. And the benefit is that we're recycling those nutrients for plant fertilizer. Terms we need to be familiar with composting. A critical one is the term active composting. It's when the carcass is rapidly decomposing into carbon dioxide, water, heat is rendered, minerals remain in the compost or the humus, as do other nutrients. In particular, the nitrogen would be fixed. We see in this active phase temperatures of 120 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Normally, we see them. Several weeks, the first several weeks of active composting we refer to as primary. In some of the old literature, we talk about turning after the primary phase, and then it becomes secondary. In systems where you turn more frequently, we may not use the terms primary and secondary. We just say that active composting continues. So therefore, active composting could continue for several months. Heat production and repeated temperature increases and decreases can occur multiple times. I want to show you just a few pictures of various types of systems. This would be a traditional bin system with 3 walls, sliding doors at the front to keep out small animals, maybe the farm dog, covered to prevent precipitation from running right through it and causing runoff problems, and a constructed apron at the front to bear the weight of loaders that would be used to move and mix the material. These are sized, as I was talking about earlier, for the appropriate flow of mortality on the farm. And it's critical then that we work on a volume basis, how many pounds per cubic foot or cubic yard, and we develop these bins so that we can flow material over a determined period of time to allow for total decomposition to occur, in particular of the soft tissue and eventually the bones, and provide then enough space in these bins to handle the entire process. In some states, the bin might be the formation, might be formed using straw bales. Could be round bales or square bales as shown here in Wisconsin, and the material is contained. It provides just some containing of the material. The downside of these types of systems is that the cost of the material, as well as then they might become a fairly attractive place for varmin such as rats and mice to make their home close to the composting process. Other types of composting systems, just an open static pile. Here shown here is 3 piles. Again, the piles are sized to handle the amount or volume of carcasses on a time per unit time basis. These piles were built on a 1-month basis, so the carcasses in 1 month were put into each pile, and then the piles are managed as batches. Shown here is a small windrow where you start at one end and lay carcasses as they occur, and then over that 1 month finish that windrow, and in the next month start a new one. So it's controlling the amount of mortality per time, or at least acknowledging it and managing it. But this would be a windrow. And this shows a under roof system we call overlapping piles, where farmers can work with a batch of mortality as a pile and have it immediately adjacent and even butting up it to against another pile. This facility has a lot less invested in concrete, but allows for the management of batches of mortality as it occurs over time. So in those systems, I'll talk once again about knowing the amount of volume and the amount of mortality that occurs over a period of time. And in general, we build our open static piles, our windrows, our bins, our overlapping piles to handle somewhere in the range of 3 to 15 pounds of mortality per cubic foot of compost space. And so you go back to your 10th grade high school geometry, where you learned how to calculate the volume of a triangle, a windrow that has a parabolic top or shape to it. You learn how to calculate the volume of a bin with one side being sloping towards the front. You can use the old geometry equations and calculate that, and then determine the flow of material. In the end, your compost will have a density of some 800 to 1,200 pounds per cubic yard. Other composting methods. Continuous flow method in an in-vessel system is shown here in this picture. They can be operated on a continuous flow with about 1,000 pounds per day added in some of these in some units that are sized to that capacity. Another in-vessel system is shown here that's being marketed in the U.S. And this is a batch type system. The batches are about 3 days in length, and about 1,200 to 1,500 pounds can be handled in this batch. What are the suggested numbers a month for a well-managed composting system? And I've shown them here. And it shows that the soft tissue, this diagram shows that the soft tissue can decompose rapidly, even with a large Holstein cow, and we've done this several times at Michigan State. We can have the soft tissue gone from that cow in a well-managed pile in 2 months or less. I put 3 here to be conservative again. When I'm planning a system, I'll err on the long side. Easily 3 months you can have the soft tissue gone using composting. And when I say well-managed, I'm saying that these conditions are achieved for active composting. Conditions of moisture, carbon and nitrogen ratio, particle size, which affects the amount of oxygen within the material. The temperature has to be achieved in order to allow the microorganisms to thrive. And the pH is very forgiving, but is important, again, for those microorganism populations to survive. Shown in small print is a blend of materials that meets those requirements, those conditions for moisture as well as carbon and nitrogen, which is shown second from the bottom, the row. Shown here that our moisture was almost 50% moisture, our carbon and nitrogen was about 32 to 1. And we used a blend of dairy manure compost, horse stall bedding, finished swine mortality compost, and fresh, clean, dry wood shavings. And that can be made on a larger scale using larger buckets on the front end of a loader. The picture I show here is just a group of students that made that material up for a study we're doing. My take-home point is that the compost amendment must be considered. It must provide the moisture and the nutrients within that range. If you use just wood shavings, if you use just chopped straw, you may be shorting the process on nitrogen. There are computer programs now that can help you do the planning. And I mentioned the equations that you can do longhand, knowing those factors. We at Michigan State developed one program called the Spartan Animal Tissue Compost System Planner. It then has entries in this program, in this case shown in green, that you enter those capacity, weights, mortality rates, and number of groups or turns, and the program will then calculate your rate of mortality. It allows you then to select criteria relative to compost bins, open static piles, overlapping piles, and it will estimate then the number of batches, bins, piles, windrows that you would need on a farm. I'm not going to go at length into how the program works. I do classes, teach how to use this. Today I just want to let you know that there are systems like this. There's a couple of others, one from Cornell as well, that will estimate the volume of a compost pile or system for a given mortality flow rate. Bones. Bones are one of the more challenging parts. They take much longer to decompose using composting than soft tissue. I'm just showing here that you can expect to take a year or longer for a healthy, mature animal of 12 to 40 months of age. Younger animals have more porous bones. They would decompose more readily. Very old animals have more brittle bones with the protein matrix gone. Those bones would decay and become brittle more readily. And in the state's requirements, most require that the bones be shattered in the spreading process. That's up to the farmer to make sure that that occurs when they're spread, that the bones do shatter and are not recognizable or retrievable by the neighbor's pets. Okay, those were the 5 major methods that are used predominantly. Other methods I mentioned may be approved by the director of the Department of Ag or Board of Animal Health, the governing body in each state. And so other methods that might be approved include feeding to other animals, anaerobic digestion, which is the sixth and only other method that's approved in Michigan, gasification, another type of slow combustion, alkaline hydrolysis or digestion at a very high pH of 12. And so each of these systems has its advantages as far as availability, as far as usefulness and appropriateness. It has its limitations as far as the amount of material that can be flowed or how that material needs to be prepared in order to flow into this system. Briefly, an example, anaerobic digestion is not suitable for whole carcasses. In fact, the carcasses would have to be reduced to portions of 1.5 inches or smaller. Alkaline hydrolysis, very limited in the amount of material that can be done in a short period of time, maybe 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, again, over a 3 to 7 day period. And then an alkaline hydrolysis unit, again, no product endorsement is intended, but it does work and it's very effective in destroying prions, such as BSE, chronic wasting disease, and scrapie. One comment about methods of mortality management. Manure storage. On all of our on many farms we have a manure storage, whether that be temporary or long-term. Shown here would be earthen storage. And those manure management or those manure storage units are not meant for mortality management. Whether it's putting large carcasses or even ground up carcasses into them, I don't know of any state that allows of that at this time, including Michigan. Minnesota has done the most research looking into that, and they have still reasons to hesitate adopting that methodology, primarily based on pathogen persistence in manure storage. I want to just finish up by talking briefly about catastrophic mortality management plans. I mentioned early on that they're important and need to be part of the farmer's management plan, whether it be a CNMP, a nutrient management plan, or a plan submitted for another voluntary environmental program. Catastrophic mortality occurs for a number of reasons: disease, fire, toxins, and weather. Shown here is the results of hurricane in North Carolina several years ago. Many animals were lost and the carcasses had to be dealt with. Emergency and catastrophic mortality events, in particularly if caused by disease, are governed nationally and even internationally. Every country learns from one another and wants to work with each other, and so national emergency policies are developed. If your farm is within a zone of infection in these cases, then you will be, your management plan will be directed by government representatives. And so mass carcass policies that the government set take into consideration a number of factors. I've listed them here: economics, environmental consideration, public relations, the physical security of those carcass disposal sites long-term, decontamination of sites, carcasses, the requirements for transportation, all are considered. I've got key governmental agencies to make you familiar with who they are: the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency, National Response Framework. The Department of the Interior is responsible for natural resources, wildlife populations. USDA and the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service are responsible for farm and agriculture. And so a lot of agencies working together to manage emergencies, including those would be veterinarian and extension and research. The veterinarian stockpile is a repository of supplies, vaccines, equipment, and other resources physically that would be used in those cases. And then we have state government agencies that become involved, and I've listed those here. And you should be familiar with them, and they may be part of the plan. In particular, your departments of agriculture and public health, transportation, and your state emergency management coordinators. what methods could be used on your farm in the future, and you might want to consider burial if there is an appropriate site for a large quantity of carcasses, landfill in your area if you have a landfill with which you and the state have negotiated that plan. Composting is a possibility if you and the state are aware of a large enough mass of material that could be used as a bulking agent or amendment. Incineration in a curtain incinerator shown here, and again enough fuel to use in incineration of a large amount of carcasses. I mentioned that rendering is becoming more prepared, for handling large amounts of mortality. Then it's a matter of transporting and the safety of that transporting. On a small scale, on a consistent basis, we might use alkaline digestion. If we can vaccinate those animals, keep them alive for a shorter, more lengthy period of time, and then euthanize them, you can see where maybe holding, vaccinating, euthanizing, and managing the carcasses might be a possibility, as well as vaccination, holding, and sending them to harvest if it's not a food safety, if the pathogen or reason for the loss is a food safety concern. So planning for mass carcass has a lot more unknowns because federal and state agencies will be involved. But you can consider where these types of events or methods could take place on your farm. And in developing your plan, that's what should be included. If I were to bury, where might that be on my farm? If I were to compost, where could that go? And if I were to incinerate, where might that be? Landfill and rendering obviously means taking those carcasses off my farm. It'd be preferred as a farmer to have that happen quickly and conveniently, but it may not be possible. So in your plan you need to write what are the possibilities. And with that, once again, it's been my pleasure just to talk through these planning challenges or criteria with you, to think about how to plan for normal and routine mortality management on the farm, as well as how to prepare for the event of a catastrophe on your farm. Thank you very much.